Lungisa, we are here. The time has come.
Finally.
If you don't mind, I'm just going to say a few nice things about your employer and about you, and then we can get started. So, you work for an institution that requires very little introduction in Africa. Standard Bank has been doing really incredible and incredibly impactful work in Africa for 160 years. It's the largest bank in Africa by total assets, giving you really significant economies of scale to contribute meaningfully to the progress in Africa, particularly in critical needs like energy and infrastructure, which we're going to talk a lot about. You've had a three-part career, a very fascinating and storied career, spanning academia. You were a lecturing economist. You spent 2 decades in civil service, including a stint working for Nelson Mandela. And you joined Standard Bank less than 10 years ago. Is there anything that I missed there?
Nothing whatsoever. Let's get on with the job.
30,000-foot view. Africa has the youngest population out of any region in the world, putting it on the cusp of a demographic dividend. What are the investment opportunities, and what are the nuances to keep in mind in this demographic shift?
Thanks, Guillaume, and greetings to everyone. One of the things that's evidenced by the wave that has happened, just as an example in East Africa, is that digital penetration on our continent is taking place at a pace that boggles the mind. And therefore, our continent has the potential to leapfrog development insofar as, for an example, the adoption of digital technologies, and on the back of those capabilities, build phenomenal modern economies. And of course, to be able to do that, one of the areas, which is the second area in which we need to invest massive resources, is energy. Because digitization, by its nature, requires energy. And in that regard, again, the continent has the potential to leapfrog development, because we no longer need coal-generated energy, certainly not on the scale at which countries need it. With the modern technologies, hydro, the former president of Colombia was speaking very eloquently about it here, wind, solar, those technologies have so advanced, have become so popular, their capabilities risen to a point where our continent has the potential to adopt them on scale at a pace never seen before, to begin to push back on its energy deficits. Of course, broader network infrastructure investments also have got to be coupled with that. If we are to harvest the critical minerals that our continent is so richly endowed on, your lithium, your cobalt, manganese, the range is huge, and help the continent, but at the same time, in helping the continent, help the world solve its carbon footprint problem. In other words, decarbonize. Then we must build the infrastructure that would enable the extraction of the minerals, to a degree, the processing thereof, but at the same time, the exportation of those minerals to the rest of the world where they are needed.
And what is Standard Bank's role in all this? Energy, infrastructure, critical minerals. How do you enter that picture, and in what way?
We do several things. One of the things that's underestimated and people don't associate us with is the convening power. As an institution that has got a footprint in 21 countries now, if you add Egypt. And it's not yesterday's footprint. In the country where the bank was established first, we've been there 163 years. In Mozambique, we were there. We are celebrating our 110th year this year. Here in New York, we've been here for 3 decades. We have a presence in London, we have a presence in Beijing. Now, with all of that, we can bring financial institutions, managers of capital from across the globe. We can also connect them with policymakers and regulators to enable conversations, meaningful conversations about investment in Africa's infrastructure and, of course, other components of investment that would drive growth.
When we host events like this, we often want to talk about the attractiveness of investing in Africa. And oftentimes we kind of inverse that and we want to talk about what African countries can do to make themselves more attractive, whether it's on the regulatory front, improving market access, or elsewhere. What do you think African countries in general can do better?
Investing in infrastructure is by its very nature, Guillaume, a long-term commitment. The payback periods are quite extended. Therefore, it becomes exceptionally important that the regulatory environment should provide predictability, should provide certainty. We need that on the continent. We need to make sure that investors don't come into our countries under one set of terms, and they wake up the following day, the terms have changed. If you do that, people are smart, they hold back, they wait for you to change again until you are tired of change. And when you become conscious that to attract investment at scale, you need to give certainty, you become steady with your policy-making processes. Don't be erratic. So we must do that. But of course, we also have to engage in the tough conversations as a continent about, for an example, harmonizing regulatory frameworks to enable certain kinds of investments. I participated in a conversation on Sunday, just a day after I had arrived in New York, where we were talking about the corridors on the continent. And someone made the point there, it could even have been me, that it wouldn't make sense that if you take the example of the Lobito corridor, if you are an investor, you face one set of regulations depending on which geography you are participating in. So surely, without disrespecting the sovereignty of nations and their capacity to make their own rules, informed by a variety of things. But when you want to crowd in to attract investment, if making it easy for investors requires that you must talk to one another as policymakers, drafters of regulations, to just make sure that you make it easy for people to come and invest in your country. And finally, I do think that it's important that we deal with the sometimes sensitive issue of enabling a meaningful conversation between rating agencies and the people in our continent. It shouldn't be like people having a conversation using a broken telephone. We understand the imperative that for rating agencies to be able to do the analysis required to arrive at rating our countries, they need information. Now, we must be able to put together that information over a period of time so that rating agencies can do a good job. But similarly, we do need to implore rating agencies that when there is something that they doubt, it doesn't serve Africa to simply then say, maybe drop them a notch 2 or 3, because that's the safest thing to do. Yeah. So we need that conversation and to bridge that gap. The sooner we do that, the better, because the perception of risk and the actual risk on the continent, there is a massive gap between the two. Let me just add this point, forgive me.
Please.
We are a bank that's the biggest by assets. We have been on the continent for the length of time that I said here. 90% of our headline earnings comes from the continent. 50% from South Africa, 40% from Africa regions, only 10% from outside of Africa. We're not about to disappear into the ground. Now, why is that so? How do you run a profitable institution if the risk you are taking does not make sense? You get my point.
Absolutely. You've invested for 160 years in the continent, and it's paid off. Turning to the overall theme of this conference, it's really about connecting the unconnected. 3 million people worldwide who lack access to mobile broadband. And we are really talking about serving communities and people. You're at Standard Bank very much working at the top of the pyramid, investing in critical systems. What are the trickle-down effects? How do you ensure that your investments really benefit people and communities?
We do it in a number of ways. In many instances, people make the mistake of only looking at a country when there is a big, lumpy project, a iconic project, sometimes we call them. And sure, those projects are important. They move the dial. But more often than not, if there is petroleum or gas to be harvested in Mozambique, as the case is right now, if you think about the ecosystem that gets created by that, for agriculture, for small businesses, for women-owned businesses, youth-owned businesses, it's immense. If you go to the place in Mozambique where the projects are, if you ask for pictures of the place before ground was broken, it's chalk and cheese. Similarly, if you think about the corridors that I mentioned, the opportunities that lie along the corridor, generated in large measure by the fact that there is that corridor there, are immense again. So it's very important to be very deliberate about making sure that you bring to fruition those opportunities. So if you think about an institution like our own, to your specific question, when we then open our risk appetite, so to speak, and look at a project in a typical country, we don't say there is $1 billion project, and therefore let's look at investing an extra billion in that country. We know that that $1 billion investment is going to crowd in $100 million for medium-sized businesses, not very small, by the way. By our definition, those are businesses that in rand terms would be about 1.5 billion rands. You can do the translation at 17.7 to the dollar. And of course, some of them would be much smaller than that. So it's important to make sure that we enable the entire value chain.
Lungisa, our time's up. But I really wanted to thank you. Thank you, Standard Bank, for the support of Next 3 Billion, and thanks for coming to New York to do this.
Obrigado. Merci beaucoup.